12 years ago, I had roughly 600 pounds of elk meat laid out on a tarp behind my cabin in October, and the nearest working refrigeration was 2 mountain passes away on a road that wasn't getting plowed for the better part of a week. That meat wasn't going into a freezer because there wasn't one to go into. It had to be salted, smoked, and dried inside 3 days, using the same steps a man would have used 150 years back, because the mountain doesn't check the calendar before it starts turning meat bad. I'm going to walk you through exactly how that's done. I'd spent 4 days packing that animal out in pieces, quarter by quarter, on my own back and a mule that wasn't thrilled about the arrangement. That's not the kind of work you let rot because you didn't plan past the shot. Out here, killing the animal is maybe a third of the job. The rest of it is keeping what you took from turning into something the coyotes get instead of you. Most hunters today never think past the cooler in the truck bed, because they've never had to. I used to be one of them. Before I moved somewhere, the cooler wasn't an option. The turning point for me wasn't clever. It was just fear, plain and simple. I remember standing over that meat, with the temperature sitting in the 50s during the day, doing the math in my head on how many hours I had before the outside of those quarters started to sour. There's a particular kind of pressure in knowing that food is either going to feed your family through winter, or it's going to be wasted because you didn't move fast enough. That pressure is exactly what built this whole body of knowledge in the first place. Nobody preserved meat for fun. They did it because the alternative was going hungry. What got me through that week wasn't some trick I read in a book. It was stuff my grandfather's generation would have called ordinary kitchen sense, and it was almost gone from my own head until I forced myself to remember it under pressure. Salt curing, smoking, and drying aren't complicated procedures. They're just procedures nobody practices anymore. So they feel foreign the first time you try them for real, with real meat on the line, instead of a recipe card. That gap between knowing something exists and actually knowing how to do it is where most people are standing right now. I want to be straight with you about something before I get into the how of it. This isn't a demonstration for the camera. This is the actual process I used that October, and it's the same process I still use every fall when an animal goes down and I've got more meat than my one small chest freezer, which runs off a solar setup that can quit on me just as easily as the grid can quit on anybody else. Every step here is one I'd stake a winter's food supply on, because I already have, more than once. There was a time, not even that long ago in the scheme of things, when knowing how to keep meat through a winter, without electricity, wasn't a specialty skill. It was just something you knew, the way you knew how to mend a fence or start a fire without a lighter. Your grandmother probably had opinions about how much salt went in a crock of pork, and she probably never wrote it down, because why would she? Everybody already knew. That kind of knowledge doesn't disappear because it stops being true. It disappears because it stops getting used. The reason I'm telling you the elk story instead of just listing steps is that the steps only make sense once you understand the stakes they were built for. Every technique I'm about to walk you through was refined by people who couldn't afford to get it wrong twice. If the salt ratio was off, or the smoke wasn't cold enough, or the meat came off the line too early, that wasn't a failed recipe. That was food a family didn't have for February. I think about that every single time I do this now, and it's why I never rush it. By the second day of that stretch, I had strips of elk hanging in a smokehouse I'd built years earlier, out of scrap tin and green aspen poles, salt-cured backstrap curing in a covered crock, and fat rendering down in a cast-iron pot over a low fire outside. None of that required a single tool you couldn't make or find on the property. That's the part that still gets me, even after doing this for years. The whole system runs on salt, smoke, airflow, and patience, and every one of those was available to people long before there was a power line anywhere near them. So that's where we're headed in this one. I'm going to go through the actual methods, in the order you'd really use them, starting with why this knowledge quietly disappeared from most households, and then moving into salt curing, smoking, drying, rendering fat, and the kind of root cellar storage that ties the whole system together. By the end, you'll understand not just what to do, but why each step works the way it does, which is the part that actually sticks with you. Refrigeration didn't replace this knowledge because it was better in every way. It replaced it because it was easier, and easier wins over time even when it makes people more fragile. Once a family could plug in a box that kept meat cold without any of the salt, smoke, or watching, there was no reason to keep passing down the older method. The kids didn't need to learn it, because the fridge wasn't going anywhere. Or so it seemed. A skill that isn't used for one generation is awfully close to being lost for good by the third. Widespread rural electrification changed the domestic landscape over the middle of the last century, and it happened fast enough that a person could watch it happen in their own lifetime. 1 decade, a farmhouse is running a root cellar and a smokehouse. The next, there's a chest freezer in the mudroom. And the smokehouse becomes a place to store tools. I'm not saying that was the wrong choice for anybody to make. I'm saying it meant an entire category of common knowledge stopped being common. Quietly, without anyone deciding to let it go. Ask most people under 50 what they'd do with 100 pounds of meat and no working refrigerator, and you'll get a blank look. Not because they're incapable, but because nobody ever needed to teach them. Their grandparents knew this cold, the exact salt ratio for a ham, the right wood for a smokehouse fire, how long bacon needed to hang before it was safe to eat sitting on a shelf. That knowledge lived in hands and kitchens, not in books, which meant it was only ever one skip generation away from disappearing entirely. Here's the part that I think matters most. A possession can be taken from you, borrowed, broken, or left behind. A skill that's actually in your hands can't be taken the same way. Once you know how salt actually preserves meat, or what smoke is doing to the surface of a piece of pork, that knowledge travels with you whether the power's on or not, whether the store down the road is stocked or not. That's the real difference between owning a freezer full of meat and knowing how to keep meat without one. I don't say any of this to make anybody feel behind. Convenience isn't a moral failing, it's just what happens when something gets easier, and nobody has a reason to keep the harder way alive. But I'd rather understand both. I still use a freezer for plenty of things, because it's efficient, and I'm not interested in doing things the hard way out of stubbornness. What I want is to not be dependent on it, so if it fails, or the power's out for a week, or I've got more meat than it can hold, I've still got options that don't need a single watt. So let's get into it properly, starting with the method that everything else in this system is built around, and the one that's been keeping meat edible longer than almost any other technique humans have come up with. Salt curing predates written history, and it predates every other method I'm going to show you, because it's the simplest chemistry a person can put to work with almost no equipment. Once you understand what salt is actually doing to that piece of meat, the rest of this system, the smoking, the drying, the fat rendering, starts to make a lot more sense, because they're all leaning on the same basic principle in different ways. Salt works by pulling moisture out of the meat through a process called osmosis, and that matters because bacteria and mold need water to survive and multiply. Take the water away, and you take away the environment that spoilage needs to take hold. That's the entire principle behind salt curing, in one sentence. And every step from here forward is just different ways of applying that same idea. It's not magic, and it's not a secret recipe. It's basic chemistry that people figured out by trial and error, long before anybody had a word for osmosis, and it still works exactly the same way today. There are 2 basic approaches to salt curing, and which one you use depends mostly on the size and shape of the cut you're working with. Dry curing means packing the meat directly in salt, letting it sit and draw moisture out over days or weeks depending on thickness. Wet curing or brining means submerging the meat in a heavily salted water solution instead. Both get you to roughly the same place, but dry curing tends to suit thinner cuts and things like bacon or jerky prep, while brining works better on larger, denser pieces like a whole ham or shoulder. For dry curing, you want a mix of coarse salt, and if you've got it, a small amount of sugar, which helps balance the flavor and feeds the right kind of bacteria that actually helps the cure rather than working against it. Pack the meat completely, every surface, in a generous, even layer, and set it in a container that can drain, because it's going to pull out liquid, and you don't want the meat sitting back in that moisture. A wooden box or a container with holes over a tray works fine. Then it goes somewhere cool, ideally under 40 degrees, out of direct sun. As a rough guide, you're looking at about 1 pound of salt for every 25 pounds of meat, if you're doing a full dry cure on something like a ham, though thinner cuts need proportionally more surface contact and less total time. This is a place where cutting corners on salt is the single most common mistake people make, because they're worried about it tasting too salty. Undersalting doesn't make milder cured meat. It makes meat that isn't actually cured. And that's a food safety problem, not a flavor preference. You can always soak out excess salt later. You can't undo spoilage. Cure time depends entirely on thickness, and this is where patience actually matters more than technique. A rough rule old-timers used was about 7 days of curing per inch of thickness at the center of the cut, though I always err toward more time rather than less if I'm unsure. A thin strip loin cures faster than a thick shoulder, obviously, but the mistake people make is rushing a thick cut because the surface looks done. The center is what matters. If in doubt, an extra few days of curing costs you almost nothing, while an undercured piece can cost you the whole thing. Wet brining follows the same logic but moves faster, because the meat is fully surrounded by a strong salt solution, instead of relying on salt migrating slowly through dry contact. A basic brine runs somewhere around 1 cup of salt per gallon of water, though old references often called for a stronger brine, strong enough that a fresh egg would float in it, which is a rough but genuinely useful test if you don't have a way to measure salinity precisely. Submerge the meat completely, weight it down if it wants to float, and keep the whole container cold the entire time it's brining. Brining time again depends on the cut, but as a general range you're looking at somewhere between a few days for smaller pieces and up to 2 weeks for something as large as a whole ham. With the same principle applying, thicker cuts need more time for the salt to fully penetrate to the center. One detail people miss is that the brine needs to stay cold throughout, ideally close to that same 40-degree range, because a warm brine is just as capable of spoiling meat as no brine at all. Cold is doing real work here, not just comfort. The mistakes that actually ruin a cure almost always come down to temperature or time, not seasoning. Curing meat somewhere too warm lets bacteria get ahead of the salt before it's had a chance to do its job. Pulling meat out too early, because it looks fine on the outside, leaves the center undercured and vulnerable. And using iodized table salt instead of a plain curing or kosher salt can actually interfere with the process and affect texture, so that's worth paying attention to if you've got a choice in what you're using. None of these mistakes announce themselves immediately, which is exactly why care matters more than confidence here. You know a dry cure is finished when the meat has firmed up considerably, feels notably denser than when it went in, and has lost a visible amount of volume from the moisture leaving it. A properly cured piece should feel almost rigid compared to fresh meat, not soft or squishy anywhere. If any part still feels soft or spongy, particularly near a bone or a thick joint, it needs more time before you move to the next stage. This is one of those things where your hands teach you faster than any explanation can, which is exactly why old-timers judge doneness by feel instead of a clock. Once meat is properly cured, salt alone can carry it for weeks in the right conditions, but combining it with smoke takes that same piece of meat from weeks to months, and that combination is really the backbone of traditional meat preservation. So let's move into the smokehouse, because this next part is where the real transformation happens. And it's also where I see people make the most avoidable mistakes if they don't understand what the smoke is actually doing beyond just adding flavor. Smoke does 3 things to meat, and only one of them is flavor, which surprises people who think of smoking as purely a seasoning technique. First, it dries the surface of the meat further, continuing the same moisture removal that salt started. Second, the compounds in wood smoke, things like certain phenols, actually have antimicrobial properties that slow bacterial growth on the surface. Third, it forms a kind of protective layer on the outside of the meat that helps seal in what curing already accomplished. Flavor is genuinely a side effect here, not the main event, even though it's the part people usually talk about first. You don't need anything elaborate to build a working smokehouse. Mine started as scrap tin roofing wrapped around a simple frame of green poles, tall enough that a person could stand inside it, with a fire pit dug a short distance away and connected by a trench or a pipe so the smoke arrives cooled rather than hot and direct. That separation between the fire and the meat is the single most important design detail, because you're trying to smoke the meat, not cook it, and those are two very different processes with very different results. Wood choice matters more than people expect. Hardwoods like oak, hickory, apple, or maple give a clean, steady smoke that suits meat well. Softwoods, like pine or fir, are something you want to avoid entirely, because they're high in resin and produce a bitter, harsh smoke that can actually leave harmful residue on the meat, rather than preserving it properly. If you're not certain what kind of wood you're working with, it's worth taking the time to identify it before you build a fire meant to run for hours next to food you're planning to eat all winter. There's a real difference between cold smoking and hot smoking, and traditional preservation almost always relies on cold smoking, meaning the temperature around the meat stays low, generally under about 90 degrees, so the meat is drying and absorbing smoke without actually cooking through. Hot smoking, by contrast, cooks the meat as it goes, which is fine if you're planning to eat it soon, but it doesn't preserve it the same way for long-term storage. If your goal is meat that lasts months without refrigeration, cold smoking with plenty of time is the method that actually gets you there. A proper preservation smoke isn't a quick afternoon project. Depending on the thickness of the meat and how long you intend to store it, you're looking at anywhere from several hours for thinner cuts up to multiple days of intermittent smoking for something thick and meant to last through an entire winter. The fire doesn't need to run constantly the whole time, but it needs to run consistently, meaning you're tending it and keeping smoke present for the majority of that period, rather than letting long gaps go by where the meat just sits exposed to open air. You'll know the smoking is doing its job when the surface of the meat develops a deep, dark mahogany color and a texture that feels dry and slightly tacky rather than moist or greasy. There shouldn't be any areas that still look pale or feel damp, especially in thicker sections or around any bone. If you press a finger into it, it should feel firm all the way through, not just on the outer edge. That firmness and color changed together are the visual and tactile signs old-timers relied on, because nobody was carrying a thermometer into a smokehouse 100 years ago. Salt and smoke together were the standard combination for most meat preservation before refrigeration existed, and there's a reason that pairing held on for so long across so many different households and regions. Salt does the initial work of pulling moisture and creating an environment bacteria can't easily survive in, and smoke finishes the job by drying the surface further and adding its own protective antimicrobial layer. Neither one alone is quite as reliable as the two working together, which is probably why almost nobody preserved meat using just one of them if they had access to both. Once meat comes out of the smokehouse properly finished, storage is fairly simple. It should be kept somewhere cool, dry, and with decent airflow, hanging rather than stacked flat if you can manage it, because airflow around the entire surface keeps moisture from building back up anywhere. A root cellar, a cool pantry, or even a well-ventilated shed can work depending on your climate. What you're avoiding is anywhere warm, anywhere humid, or anywhere the meat sits directly against another surface without air moving around it, since that's exactly the kind of environment that undoes all the work you just put in. I do want to flag one real risk here, because this is the one place in the whole process where getting careless actually matters. Improperly cured or smoked meat, especially if it's undersalted or stored somewhere too warm and airless, can create conditions for dangerous bacteria to grow, including the kind responsible for botulism, which doesn't always show obvious signs of spoilage before it becomes dangerous. This isn't a reason to be afraid of the process. It's been done safely for centuries, but it is a reason to actually follow proper salt ratios and cool storage, rather than guessing or rushing. With salt and smoke covered, there's one more preservation method that's arguably even older than either of those, and it doesn't need a smokehouse at all, just meat, thin cuts, and the right conditions to pull moisture out fast before anything has a chance to spoil. That's drying, and it's probably the method most people have at least heard of, even if they've never actually done it themselves. because some version of jerky shows up in nearly every culture that's ever needed to travel with food or store it through a lean season without any means of keeping it cold. Drying works on the exact same principle as salt curing, removing the water bacteria need to survive, except it does the job through airflow and low heat instead of chemistry. This is likely the oldest meat preservation method there is, because it requires almost nothing beyond meat, a knife, and patience. Long before anyone had access to a container of salt or built a smokehouse, people were slicing meat thin and letting sun and wind do the work. It's simple, but simple doesn't mean careless, because getting the cut and the conditions wrong is exactly how you end up with spoiled meat instead of preserved meat. The cut matters more than most people expect going into this. You want to slice the meat thin, somewhere around 1/4 inch, and you want to cut against the grain rather than with it, which shortens the muscle fibers and makes the finished product easier to chew rather than stringy and tough. Trim away as much visible fat as you can before drying, because fat doesn't dry the same way lean muscle does. It can turn rancid well before the meat itself would spoil, and that's one of the fastest ways to ruin an otherwise good batch. Traditional drying relies on airflow more than direct heat, which is a distinction worth understanding. Hanging strips in open shade with good wind movement can work well in the right climate, particularly somewhere dry with low humidity. In damper conditions, or during colder months, low indirect heat from a fire, well away from open flame, helps push the process along without cooking the meat outright. What you're after either way is steady moisture loss over hours, not a quick blast of heat, because rushing this stage tends to dry the outside while leaving the inside still wet and vulnerable. Humidity is really the enemy of this entire method, more than temperature ever is. In a humid climate, meat can sit for a full day and barely lose moisture, giving mold or bacteria plenty of time to get established before the drying process ever catches up. If you're working somewhere damp, that's exactly when supplementing with gentle heat and strong airflow, like a fan or a spot near a low fire, becomes important rather than optional. Checking your strips regularly for any sign of a slick, slimy texture or an off smell is worth doing throughout the process, not just at the end. You'll know jerky is properly dried when it bends without snapping cleanly in half, but also shows small cracks or fraying at the bend, rather than folding smoothly like fresh meat would. It should feel notably lighter than when you started, since you've removed a significant amount of its original weight in water. There shouldn't be any cool, moist spots anywhere in a piece, especially toward the thicker end of a strip. If a piece still feels cool and damp to the touch compared to the rest, that's a sign it needs more time before you consider the batch finished. Properly dried meat, stored right, can last for months without any refrigeration at all, which is exactly why it became such a staple for anyone traveling or anyone needing food that wouldn't spoil through a long stretch without resupply. Store it somewhere cool and dry, ideally in a breathable container like a cloth sack or a wooden box, rather than sealed tightly in plastic, since trapped moisture is the fastest way to undo a good drying job after the fact. Check on stored batches periodically, particularly in the first couple of weeks, since that's when any missed moisture tends to show itself. Dried meat isn't only useful eaten as is. It rehydrates well in soups, stews, or just simmered in water for a while, softening back into something close to its original texture and releasing a good amount of flavor into whatever it's cooking in. That's actually how a lot of dried meat historically got used, not eaten dry off the strip, the way modern jerky snacks are marketed, but broken down and added back into a pot as the backbone of a meal. It's a versatile ingredient once you stop thinking of it purely as a snack food. Between salt curing, smoking, and drying, you've already got 3 methods that can carry meat through most of a year without power. But there's a 4th piece to this system that people almost always overlook, and it's the part that deals with the one component of the animal that spoils fastest and ruins everything around it if you ignore it. That's the fat, and how you handle it is the difference between a preserved meat supply that lasts and one that turns rancid from the inside out, no matter how well you salted or smoked everything else. Fat spoils faster than lean muscle tissue does, which is why so much of traditional preservation actually treats it as a separate ingredient rather than leaving it attached to the meat you're curing. Rendering, meaning slowly melting fat down over low heat until it separates from any connective tissue, converts it into something far more stable, called tallow, that can last for months, stored properly, sometimes longer, well beyond what raw fat sitting on a cut of meat ever could. This is a step a lot of modern cooking skips entirely, since we're used to buying fat already separated or already stabilized. Rendering itself is straightforward, even if it takes time. Cut the fat into smaller pieces to help it melt evenly, and heat it slowly, over low, steady heat, never high heat, stirring occasionally so nothing scorches on the bottom of the pot. As it melts, any solid bits of connective tissue or meat left in it will separate out, and you strain those off, usually through cloth, leaving behind clean, liquid fat. Let that liquid cool, and it solidifies into tallow, a stable, long-lasting product that stores at room temperature in a cool space, far better than raw fat ever would. Tallow isn't just useful on its own, it's also a preservation tool in itself. Pouring rendered, still warm fat over cooked or cured meat and letting it solidify around the meat creates a seal that keeps air away from the surface, which is exactly the kind of barrier that slows spoilage. This is essentially the same principle behind confit, a method with roots in older European food preservation, where meat gets fully submerged in fat and can then be stored for extended periods because the fat seal keeps oxygen and airborne bacteria from ever reaching the meat directly. Now, take dried meat, pound it down into something close to a coarse powder, mix it with an equal or greater amount of rendered fat, and you've got pemmican, which might be the single most efficient preserved food this whole tradition ever produced. Some versions include dried berries or other dried fruit mixed in as well, adding a bit of natural sugar and variety to what would otherwise be a fairly plain mixture of protein and fat. The result is dense, calorie-rich, lightweight, and remarkably stable, which made it invaluable for anyone needing to travel long distances without resupply. The reason pemmican lasts so long comes down to the same principle running through this entire video: removing water and sealing out air. The meat has already had its moisture pulled out through drying, and the fat surrounding it creates a barrier against oxygen and airborne contamination. Stored properly, in a cool, dry place, pemmican can last well over a year, and some accounts describe batches lasting considerably longer than that under the right conditions. That kind of shelf stability, without any refrigeration at any point in the process, is honestly hard to match with most modern preserved foods. If you put these methods side by side, the shelf life differences are worth understanding because they change how you'd actually use each one. Fresh meat with no preservation at all is measured in a couple of days before real risk sets in, depending on temperature. Salt-cured meat, stored properly cool, can run several weeks to a couple of months. Smoked and cured meat together can extend that out towards several months. And pemmican, done right, can last well over a year. None of these are competing methods, really. They're tools you reach for depending on how long you need that meat to last. It's worth remembering that pemmican wasn't some rare specialty food reserved for expeditions. It was standard travel food for trappers, long hunters, and plenty of frontier households who needed something calorie-dense that wouldn't spoil across weeks of travel or a hard winter stretch with limited hunting opportunities. A person could live on it, not comfortably forever, but genuinely, for extended periods when nothing else was available. That's a level of food security built entirely from a knife, a fire, and patience, without a single piece of modern equipment involved anywhere in the process. So between curing, smoking, drying, and rendering, you've got a complete system that covers nearly everything you'd need to keep meat through a season without power. But all of that still needs somewhere to actually sit once it's finished. Somewhere cool and stable enough that the work you already put in doesn't get undone by a bad storage spot. That's where a root cellar, or something like it, comes into the picture, and it's the last piece that ties this whole approach together. A root cellar doesn't need to be an elaborate structure. At its simplest, it's just a space dug into the ground or built partially underground, taking advantage of the fact that soil temperature stays far more stable year-round than the air above it does. Even a modest cellar, 3 or 4 feet down, tends to hold a temperature well below what you'd see outside in summer, and well above freezing in most winters, which is exactly the narrow, stable range that preserved meats, along with root vegetables and other stored food, do best sitting in for extended periods. Humidity matters here almost as much as temperature. A root cellar that's too damp can actually undo dried or cured meat by reintroducing moisture, while one that's too dry can make things like fresh vegetables shrivel faster than they should. A dirt floor and some ventilation, even just a simple vent pipe or gap near the top, helps balance that naturally, letting some airflow through without letting the temperature swing wildly. This is one of those systems where a bit of trial and error in your specific ground and climate teaches you more than any fixed formula could. Fermentation is worth a brief mention here too, since it's another old preservation tool that pairs well with everything else in this system, particularly for vegetables stored alongside cured meats in a cellar. The basic idea is using salt and naturally occurring bacteria to create an environment that favors preservation over spoilage, similar in principle to curing meat, but applied differently. It's a deep enough topic that it deserves its own full explanation, rather than a quick mention here, so I'll leave it at that for now, and come back to it properly another time. Now, back to that October with the elk. By the third day, the backstrap had finished its dry cure and gone straight into the smokehouse. The fattier cuts were rendering down into tallow, and I had thin strips drying on a rack near the wood stove, since the weather outside had turned too damp for open-air drying that week. Every part of that 600 pounds ended up somewhere in this system. Nothing wasted, nothing lost to spoilage. And by the end of that stretch, I had meat that would carry well into the following spring. It wasn't perfect, and I'll be honest about that, because I think the near misses matter more than the clean successes when you're actually learning something. One batch of the dry cured meat sat a little too close to a damp cellar wall for the first 2 days, and I caught a faint sour smell on it before it went any further, which meant pulling it, checking it carefully, and resalting a portion I wasn't fully confident in, rather than risk it. That's the kind of judgment call that only comes from paying close attention, not from following a recipe exactly and assuming it'll be fine. The lesson that stuck with me out of that whole week wasn't really about salt ratios or smoke times, even though I've walked you through plenty of those specifics. It was that this entire system rewards attention far more than it rewards memorization. You can know every number I've given you and still ruin a batch if you're not actually watching, smelling, and feeling the meat at every stage. Old-timers didn't have our numbers written down half the time, but they had decades of paying close attention, and that's really the skill underneath all the specific techniques. That's really what self-reliance comes down to in most of these old skills. It's not about owning the right gear or following the right checklist perfectly. It's about understanding a process well enough that you can adapt when conditions aren't exactly what the instructions assumed they'd be, because they almost never are. A colder night than expected, a damper cellar than you'd like, meat that's a little fattier than usual. All of that requires judgment, not just steps, and judgment only comes from actually doing the thing yourself, more than once, including the times it doesn't go perfectly. I think that's the real value in learning something like this, beyond just the practical use of it. There's a specific kind of confidence that comes from knowing that if the power went out tonight, for a week, for a month, you'd still know how to take an animal from the field to a shelf where it'll keep for months, using nothing but salt, smoke, fire, and time. That confidence doesn't come from owning a generator or a big chest freezer. It comes from having the actual process sitting in your hands, which nobody can take from you the way they could take a piece of equipment. I'd rather have both, honestly, the modern convenience and the older knowledge underneath it, because I don't think self-reliance means rejecting anything that makes life easier. It means not being helpless the moment that easier option isn't available anymore. Whether that's from a storm, a bad month, or just having more meat on hand than any freezer was built to hold. That's really the whole philosophy behind everything I try to pass along here, keeping the skills alive underneath the convenience, so the convenience is a choice, rather than something you're stuck depending on. If your family did this differently than what I've walked through today, I'd genuinely like to hear about it, because these methods vary a fair amount region to region and household to household, and there's usually a good reason behind whatever variation someone's grandparents settled on. Drop a comment on what you remember, or what's been passed down to you, even if it's just a fragment of it, a ratio somebody mentioned once, or a particular wood somebody swore by for smoking. This kind of knowledge survives better when people compare notes than when any one version gets treated as the only right way. There's also a decent chance some of what I described doesn't match exactly what worked in your climate, and that's worth saying plainly. A dry western mountain environment behaves differently than a humid southern one, and the exact times and conditions I've given you are starting points, built around what's worked for me, not universal law. Adjust for your own humidity, your own temperature swings, and pay attention the first time you try any of this, rather than assuming it'll behave identically to what I've described. That adjustment process is honestly part of actually learning the skill, not a failure of the instructions. None of what I've covered today requires you to go buy anything specialized. Salt, a knife, fire, and a bit of shelter from rain and direct sun will get you through curing, smoking, and drying. All three, without spending much of anything beyond what most people already have sitting in a kitchen or a garage. That's part of why this knowledge held on for as long as it did before convenience replaced it. It never depended on having money for equipment. It depended on having the patience and the attention to do it right, which is available to anybody willing to put in the time. Next time, I want to get into the root cellar and fermentation side of this more fully, because storing meat is only half the picture when you're trying to get through a winter without relying on a grid. Vegetables, dairy, even eggs, all have their own older methods that pair naturally with everything I've covered today, and together, they add up to something close to a complete food system that doesn't need electricity to function through a hard season. None of this is about preparing for some dramatic scenario that may never happen. It's about not feeling helpless in front of an animal you worked hard to bring home, or a bad month, or a power line down for longer than anybody expected. That's a fairly ordinary kind of capability, the sort people used to just have as a matter of course, and it's still sitting there waiting for anybody willing to actually practice it, instead of just watching somebody else do it once on a screen. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, stick around, because there's a lot more of the old system I haven't touched on yet, and I'll keep working through it one piece at a time, the same unhurried way I do everything else out here. Subscribe if that's useful to you, so you're around when the next piece of this comes out, and until then, go put some of this into practice yourself, even on a small scale, because reading about it and actually doing it are two very different kinds of knowing. I'll see you out here again soon.